he had a meeting with his Security Council a day or two ago. And I've seen him snarl. I've seen him spit feathers. I've seen him, kind of furious. And he seemed a wee bit lost. He seemed, he was reading from paper, from notes he'd written by hand. And he wasn't snarling. And he still wasn't calling it war. He was still trying to talk about a special military operation. He's still trying to sort of present what's happening as something contained, something where he's still in control. He was talking about the humanitarian side of it, about how Russia will look after all the people, that are being evacuated from their homes. But I can't help thinking in the back of my mind that at some point, those civilians won't matter and that he will respond, the military will respond ferociously. But at the moment, they do seem to be massively on the back foot.
Let's start, Sarah, with your current status. Chucked out of Russia, when did they do it? And is there any chance you could ever go back?
It was almost exactly 3 years ago, so August 2021. And no, I have a piece of paper from the FSB security service that makes it quite clear that as far as they're concerned, I'm a national security threat, in inverted commas for me. And that I've been banned indefinitely. It says bezsrochna, which means basically for good. So no, I think as long as Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin and as long as the FSB is in charge in Russia, then there's no way I can go back.
We need to make clear that although you are a very fervent critic, and why wouldn't you be, of Putin and the regime, you love the country and you have a long relationship with it.
I think I would dispute the word love. Lots of people assume that I love Russia, which is a strong word, I think, for any country. I have a long attachment to Russia and many years association with the country. It's basically a relationship of 3 decades with Russia ever since I first went there in 1992. And I arrived just 2 weeks after the Soviet Union had collapsed. So it was a completely different place. I was 18 years old. It was a very, very exciting time. I landed I came from Worcester, or a village outside Worcester, and I'd landed in Moscow. It was minus 20 degrees. I was being raced across this vast city with these massively kind of imposing buildings by a man in a little Lada, where I had to scrape the ice off the window to be able to see anything of the city outside. It was an amazing experience. And then over 30 years, both as a student of Russian and traveling to Russia and working in Russia, and then arriving there as a journalist at the very beginning of Putin's time in power, I basically saw a country transformed. And I kind of witnessed that firsthand and very close up through my reporting, but also through my personal relationships with Russia. And it kind of felt like I wanted to document that because Russia today is such a different place and such a dangerous place. And I wanted to try and explain from my perspective, a very personal perspective, how I guess Russia had been and has been, I think, lost for now, and how dangerous that is.
But during your long association with Russia, there have been moments when it seemed like Russia would join us, at one point there was even talk of them joining NATO, wasn't there?
Yeah, but I think if you look back, there have been so many signs and signals of where Vladimir Putin was leading Russia that in a way it seems like perhaps we were naive. I mean, I just working on this book and kind of looking back through all my reporting over the years and right back to 2000, I arrived in Russia 24 years ago to work for the BBC. And it was the day, in fact, exactly this day, 24 years ago, it was the day that Russia admitted that the Kursk nuclear submarine had sunk. For 2 days, they'd lied. They covered it up. And they refused, once they admitted it had happened, they refused all foreign help to try to rescue the submariners. And so 118 men died, not in the first explosion. 23 of them survived the explosion, and they suffocated to death because the Russian state didn't save them. It didn't make that the priority. The priority was secrecy. The priority was hiding the humiliation of the loss of this atomic submarine. The priority was not allowing NATO countries to come and help. And that was Vladimir Putin then, 24 years ago. And, the roots of what he is today go way, way back to those times. And that, for example, was when I think Putin realized the power of journalism and the power of the press, because he was so criticized in the Russian media in his own country for what he did with the Kursk disaster, that basically he began his war on the television channels. He took over eventually TV channels. So I think, that was such a sort of seminal moment. And that was, 24 years ago. So there were
Yes.
signs right at the beginning.
It is interesting. You also drew my attention, reminded me of that horrific school siege. And at the end of that, there were more dead hostages than terrorists. It was very poorly handled by the authorities. And again, he got away with it.
Yeah, I mean, that was atrocious. We were the first foreign journalists there. And for me, it was the most intense reporting experience of my life. I lived in a family, within the family, in the home of a family who had children and a grandmother inside the school. I met the father on the flight on the way down to Beslan. And he basically, he thought we could help them because we could probably get more information about what was going on. And obviously for us, kind of being with them was also journalistically important, but it also was that kind of connection that you don't normally get on a story. And it was, so Beslan wasn't really a story. It was a huge story, but it was also this very intense kind of personal relationship. And I, kept in touch with that family I'm still in touch with them now. But yeah, that I think you can judge a country, can't you? I think by the way it treats its citizens, its civilians, human beings. And I think, that showed how Vladimir Putin treated his people. And ultimately for him, it was more important to kill the terrorists who'd taken over that school than to worry too much about saving lives. So hundreds of people were killed, including so many children. I think it was 186 children who were killed. And I remember seeing the day of the funerals, that there was gridlock on the way to the cemetery. You could not get past because there were so many coffins, so many children being buried.
But he is still there, and his opponents, there aren't that many left because so many of them meet with unfortunate ends. He's sort of a bit of an international laughingstock, Botoxed up to the eyeballs. We occasionally try and comfort ourselves with the idea that he might be seriously ill. But actually, I mean, what do you know about that? He's very much still with us and still with Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea about the rumors. There've been rumors about his health for so many years, and occasionally he would disappear off. When I was still based in Russia, I think there was a period when he disappeared for 2 weeks, and there were all sorts of rumors about where he might be, and all sorts of theories about whether he had cancer, whether he had some serious back problems. What exactly was wrong with him? And yeah, he does have a very puffy face sometimes, and he does have this strange twitch in his leg and one of his arms. But I have no idea if there's anything wrong with him or whether some people are just engaged in wishful thinking. But he is very much still in power at this point, and of course prosecuting this massively, devastating war on Ukraine. And yeah. I think at the moment it looks like he's pretty firmly still in power. Though of course, there's this massive operation in the Kursk region, which is, I think, a big deal for him politically as much as it is militarily on the ground.
Well, let's focus on that then. It is a humiliation for Russia. Is it? I mean, how do you imagine Putin will be dealing with it?
I think it was interesting for me knowing how he deals with humiliation. I mean, I throw you back to the Kursk submarine disaster. It was interesting watching him speaking. He had a meeting with his Security Council a day or two ago, and I've seen him snarl. I've seen him spit feathers. I've seen him, kind of furious, and he seemed a wee bit lost. He seemed, he was reading from paper, from notes he'd written by hand, and he wasn't snarling, and he still wasn't calling it war. He was still trying to talk about a special military operation. He's still trying to sort of present what's happening as something contained, something where he's still in control. He was talking about the humanitarian side of it, about how Russia will look after all the people, that are being evacuated from their homes. But I can't help thinking in the back of my mind that at some point those civilians won't matter and that he will respond, the military will respond ferociously. But at the moment, they do seem to be massively on the back foot. And that's, that's a new feeling for Putin in this 2.5 years of war in Ukraine. That they have taken the war home to Russians and to Russia. And it will be interesting, I think, to see how people in Russia respond to that, depending on how long it goes on and how far it goes.
But isn't there a real chance that he will revert to type and just flatten the whole region? Because he's indicated in the past he doesn't care. Life, as long as it's not his own life, is extraordinarily cheap as far as he's concerned.
Yeah, that is the danger. But again, of course, it has a political cost potentially, because if he is willing to do that, then what does that say about the man in the Kremlin, if he's prepared to sacrifice that many lives. But he's shown that he's done that kind of thing before. So it is possible, yeah.
You draw attention throughout the book to those people who have been brave enough to attempt to stand up to him and the regime. And it really made me wonder how many of us would have the strength to do that if we were ever in a similar situation. Just briefly, if you don't mind, tell us the story of the very elderly woman you met, Vera, who I think her neighbours were incredibly dismissive and perhaps more than dismissive of her.
Yeah, that was Vera Gorlieva, and she was in her 80s, I think, when I met her. She died a few years ago. She's a bit different because she wasn't so much criticising the current regime. She, of course, was a woman who went to jail in Stalin's time for telling a joke. And I think it was this really telling moment that I sat with her and I was listening to her story, and she was telling me about that historical, outrageous injustice, right? She lost a child. I think she had a miscarriage, if I remember rightly, when she was in prison. She was forced to do hard labour. She was building railway lines, shifting boulders, way beyond up in the Arctic Circle, I think, if I remember rightly. But the point was, she was telling me this story, and I realised as we were sitting on the bench in the yard of her apartment block and we were filming this interview, there were a couple of women kind of earwigging in the background, and they sort of, I could see them sort of looking over with these kind of suspicious looks. And when we finished, they sort of shouted over, and they were sort of like, "Who are you?" They realised when I replied that we were foreign. I said BBC, and they were like, what she's saying, is she talking bad of Russia? And she's talking badly of Russia. She'll kind of basically she'll get it if she was. These kind of threats in, what was it, 2000 and goodness knows what, 15, 16, 17, threats from people against a woman who was talking about what historically had been done to her in Stalin's Russia. And, for them today, the fact that she was telling that to foreign media was somehow betraying her country now. And I think it was pretty telling about the sort of state of mind of many Russians who've been taught
and I guess
that people are enemies, right? People who criticize Russia are enemies of the state.
And that serves as a really good illustration of why Putin is still in power, why he's effective, because it's a gangster state, it's a giant prison, and everyone lives in terror. And there are very few people able to stick their head above the parapet.
Yeah, and because the propaganda is so powerful. I think, the control of state television has been a massive win for Putin, because it has given him an extremely powerful tool and weapon in his ability to prosecute the war that he's prosecuting now. Because I think, if you live in a country where, we might complain about the media in our own countries, we might complain about, bias or independence or whatever, you can have those debates. But in Russia, there is no debate. There is simply a propaganda machine which lies daily to the people who watch it. And I think you don't realize until you live there how very pervasive that is and how very influential it is. Because if you have that turned on in the background, or if it is your social media kind of everyday reality, unless you put on a VPN, unless you actively seek out something else, then it does get into your head. It is in the air everywhere. It is the noise from your radio. It is the noise from your phone. It is what you breathe. And I heard so many people over the years just repeating back the stuff that I was watching and hearing on state media, that I realized just how clever it was, frankly, to control the media in that way. And I think unless you live in it and breathe it and feel it every day, you don't quite realize just how powerful it is, even for intelligent people, who might think that they were thinking independently and for themselves.
So how do you think this will end for Putin? Can you imagine covering his trial in The Hague? It's not going to happen, is it?
It's really hard to say. I don't know how it ends for Putin. I think the war in Ukraine is incredibly important. How that ends is incredibly important to how Vladimir Putin continues or otherwise to rule Russia. I think that's important to how the West builds a relationship with Russia in the future. Whether sanctions are maintained, whether there's any dialogue, possibility of dialogue in the future. I know certainly, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine in the past 2.5 years, and certainly I think people in Ukraine would argue very firmly that there should be no dialogue with Putin, with Russia. They want to see him on trial, of course, and he is a wanted war criminal. He has been indicted by the International Criminal Court, and that there ought to be at some point some kind of prosecution. I think, it's interesting as well talking to Russian dissidents. You talked about some of the brave people who've stood up to Putin. And I've spent a lot of time over the years documenting their stories and recently speaking to some of those who were released in this big prisoner swap. And they argue very firmly that Vladimir Putin has to pay a price for what he's done to Ukraine, but also what he's done to Russia. And so I think they want that message to be kind of transmitted by them now outside Russia to the world, to the international community, that, the importance of maintaining sanctions and maintaining pressure.
But just looking at what's happened in the last couple of days with the Ukrainians entering Russian territory, just for those of us who aren't experts in military matters, does this make an end to the war in the short term more likely, do you think?
I mean, it really depends how it goes. I mean, I was just watching just now Ukrainian reporters inside Russian territory filming Ukrainian soldiers taking down the Russian flag from buildings. And it is a complete flip, a complete reversal from what Russians have been doing since 2014 in Ukraine. So it was unimaginable. It's actually crazy to watch that happening. And I think, both Putin and analysts of the West and politicians in Ukraine have started talking about this as some kind of move towards possible negotiations about ending the war. I think it's quite clear that Ukraine wants to end the war. It doesn't want people to keep dying, but it wants to end it on its terms. So potentially this is Ukraine's way of saying, if you want to talk to us, then, we are actually going to talk from a position of power, not a position of weakness, which is obviously what Vladimir Putin wants. And again, the total lack of irony listening to Vladimir Putin saying, well, how can we negotiate with people who target civilians and hit civilian infrastructure? I mean, the man just must live in a totally different world to the rest of us.